Ready, set, go. Yeah. Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Yeah, perfect. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to those in different time zones watching us online. Thank you so much for joining us at this event co-organized by Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the IMF. The goal of this event is to mark the publication of a new book by the IMF on promoting inclusive growth in the Middle East and North Africa. Working towards an inclusive development agenda is especially important given the current crises and challenges facing the MENA region. Several Arab countries have been severely hit by the surge in food and energy prices sparked by the war in Ukraine. The level of acute food insecurity across the region has increased, macroeconomic imbalances have intensified, and social grievances have been on the rise. Meanwhile, several low and middle-income countries have found themselves struggling with debts and deficits with a non-existent fiscal space to address socioeconomic claims. And just like with COVID, the economic ramifications of these different economic shocks will likely be unequal, as they would hit more severely the poor and the most vulnerable. So given all these challenges facing the MENA region, it is timely to revisit the idea of inclusion and inclusive growth, which is at the heart of the book published by the IMF. To discuss the ideas in the book, the different challenges facing the MENA region, and what policymakers can do to address these challenges, we're very delighted to have our panelists, four esteemed panelists with us today. So we have Mr. Masood Ahmed, who is president of the Center for Global Development. He has a long career driving economic development policy initiatives relating to debt, aid effectiveness, trade, and global economic prospects at several international institutions, including the World Bank, the IMF, and the Fed. We also have Mrs. Rania Al-Mashat, who is Egypt's Minister of International Cooperation and used to be the first female Minister of Tourism. She also served as advisor to the chief economist at the IMF in Washington, D.C. We're also delighted to have Mr. Jihad Azzour, who is the Director of the Middle East and Central Asia Department at the IMF, where he oversees work on the Middle East, North Africa, and Central Asia. And last but not least, we have Mrs. Laura Ripani, who is the head of the Labor Markets Division at the Inter-American Development Bank in DC. Her main research focus is on the future of work, with a particular focus on improving opportunities for women and youth. Thank you so much for joining us. And I am Noor Arafeh. I'm a fellow at Carnegie Middle East Center. My research focus is on the political economy of the Middle East and the political economy of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. I will be moderating this event. So before we start the discussion with our panelists, we have a pre-recorded introductory remarks by the IMF Managing Director, Kristalina Georgieva.
Good morning. It is a pleasure to welcome you to inflation escalated rapidly and has become more persistent.
Good morning. It is a pleasure to welcome you to this event organized jointly by the IMF and our hosts for today, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I'm not far away, but my schedule during our annual meetings regrettably prevents me from joining you in person. Today we are releasing a new IMF book on promoting inclusive growth in the Middle East and North Africa, challenges and opportunities in a post-pandemic world. This book is important for the region, and it holds special significance as we look ahead and prepare for the 2023 annual meetings, which will take place in Marrakesh, Morocco, after 2 postponements due to the pandemic. So when, inshallah, we meet in Marrakesh next year, it will be happening under very different circumstances than we had envisaged when we planned the meetings. We have been through a rough ride these past years. Just as the global economy was bouncing back from the depth of the COVID crisis, Russia's invasion of Ukraine sent economic shockwaves around the world. And after a recession in 2020, global growth has faltered, inflation escalated rapidly, and has become more persistent. Higher food prices, threats to food security have been especially hard for low-income households and for millions of people across the MENA region. Even more concerning over the long term is the potential fragmentation of the world economy, which could jeopardize the economic gains made over the past decades. So the focus of this book on inclusion is especially timely and relevant, and it embraces 2 important lessons from the pandemic: protect the vulnerable and invest in a more inclusive future. The ability to weather shocks and to build a more resilient, inclusive, and sustainable economy will take an ambitious effort, but it will lead to revitalizing our economies. We need a transformational recovery. This is especially true for the MENA region. 10 years after the Arab Spring, it remains as critical as ever to create more opportunities and to create more fair opportunities for all, in particular for young people, for women, for entrepreneurs. The book we are launching today pulls together a cross-section of recent IMF research that assesses various approaches for addressing these challenges: reducing gender inequality, improving access to social protection systems and financial services, adapting to climate change and developing greener economies, fostering new economic opportunities for the private sector, and harnessing the benefit of technological transformation in how we work. Our hope is that the analysis and policy recommendation in this book will help guide our discussions throughout the year and when we are in Marrakesh on the priorities for economic and social reforms in MENA and beyond. The 2023 annual meetings will be an important milestone for the IMF and Morocco, but also for the whole Middle East and North Africa region. Working together, we can seek to build on the progress achieved thus far and continue towards a more equitable and inclusive future that benefits all the citizens of the region. I wish you a thought-provoking discussion today, and I hope to see many of you in Morocco next year. Thank you.
Address 10 years after is based on the lessons learned from 10 years of work on these issues. that in certain cases have helped address some of the challenges, even have mainstreamed some of the policies into even our programs. There are certain number of emerging issues that needed to be addressed too. And the book is trying to take a look at, I would say, through both the analytical dimension of it and the integration of all these pieces together to refresh the work on inclusion, because same objectives are still very valid today. And also, this, for an institution like the fund, who has been dealing with those issues, of course, from a macro perspective, this type of analysis is very important to guide our work. We were planning to have this book launched, as the managing director said earlier, in Marrakesh at the annual meetings. And I would confess, when we started the book, the team who is here in the room, we were in a different context. We started a few weeks before the outbreak of COVID. We were not expecting that this first shock will be followed by other shocks. And what the team has done is more relevant than ever, because now we are facing high level of inflation, risk of recession, the problem of climate that is showing every day that this is an important issue that we need to deal with. And therefore, this work has, I hope, will pave the way for some of the policy directions that government, international community will work together in order to put those recommendations in place. Of course, this is a continuum of work, and hopefully when we get to Marrakesh next year, there will be other pieces where we address not only the issue of inclusion, but also the issue of climate, which is very important, as well as also other very relevant issues to the region.
Perfect. And we're going to talk about climate in some time, but I want us first to focus on the concept of inclusion, because the book highlights that inclusion is a complex phenomenon with several dimensions. We can talk about equality in the distribution of income and wealth, to equality in opportunities and access to public services. So, Mr. Ahmed, when you hear about the need to make growth more inclusive, what is it that you think about? Is there a specific dimension that concerns you the most and that you think needs to be prioritized when we talk about inclusion?
Well, thank you very much, Noor, first of all, and to all your colleagues for inviting me. And I want to start off really by commending Jihad and the team that has put together this book. I think it's worth reading, and if you haven't had a chance to look at it yet, I would encourage you to look at it, because it does bring together, as Jihad just said, all the different dimensions of inclusion into more of an integrated, coherent framework. And I think that's great value added. All the elements of inclusion, dimensions of inclusion that are reflected in the different chapters of the book are important. But if I were to pick out, I would say two, one of which worries me and one of which frustrates me. And the one that worries me is that we still have between a quarter and a third of young people who are inactive. And we've seen this for a decade. We've analyzed this every which way, how it affects. If you get a little more educated, you're more likely to be inactive. So, but it does worry me because it's becoming a little bit of a norm now in the countries. People just accept this, that between a quarter and a third of young people won't work, won't study. They're just existing in some way, sometimes with family support, sometimes with other means. And I just think that this is a phenomenon that is building up potential problems for society down the road that we still haven't come to grips with. That's one dimension. And the second one that frustrates me more is that there's been, despite the progress that we've seen, the gender gaps in the region just remain twice as large in terms of employment, for example, as the rest of the world. And I don't really see the kind of progress in narrowing those gaps. We've done a lot of work on education. I think gender gaps are narrowing in education. But when you come into the labor market, even if you have equality in education, the gaps start to appear when people come into the workplace. And so it's something that is partly going to be dealt with through the educational system, but a lot of it is still laws and norms that make it harder for women to be able to realize their full potential in the way they want once they come out of the school system. And the last thing I want to say is something the book doesn't cover, sort of missing chapter in my book, which is voice and the feeling of being an insider or an outsider. It's a harder thing to get your hands around in a book done by the IMF, so I'm kind of okay with the IMF book not covering it. But it's a very real dimension of inclusiveness, is this constant sense in the region, in almost every country, that you're either connected and you're part of the inside group, in which case all the things appear easier to solve, all the daily problems of your life are easier, you do get a job, you do manage to get the support you need, or you're outside, in which case you not only don't have the access to be able to realize your potential, and a lot of these 1/3 youth who are unemployed are outsiders, but you also don't feel that you have an ability to say what you think. So voice and dignity is a big issue, and I must say this is something I feel personally that I underestimated the value of when I was working inside a very economically focused world. But now I see this as probably being more of a problem that we have to find a way to address. And I think you have to address this to be able to address some of the other problems. Actually, Marwan Mashar, he and I have had this long-standing conversation where he would always say to me, none of what you want to achieve can be achieved until we actually have sort of more liberalization or more voice. And I was sort of say, yes, true, but in the meantime, let's get on with doing these things. And I'm beginning to come around to thinking that Marwan was more right than I was.
Yeah. It's a fascinating point because everything is interconnected, so we can't just look at the economic side of it, but we also have to look at issues of citizen participation, as you said, the insider, outsider perspective. Thank you so much, Mr. Ahmed. I'm going to move to Mrs. Al-Mashat. The current war on Ukraine has had huge economic effects on the MENA region, especially given their dependence on food imports from Ukraine and Russia, which led to rise in food prices. And we have seen this specifically in a place like Egypt, the rising levels of acute food insecurity. In your views, how should policymakers address the current food crisis unfolding in the region, and what are the main challenges facing them?
Well, thank you very much, and it's really an honor being here with the two directors of the Middle East Department. When I was at the central bank, Masoud was there, and when I went back to the fund, Jihad was there. Before I answer that question, I want to link it to inclusion as well, because for all countries today, and the pandemic has accelerated this, when you're designing your strategies, 3 words have to come into place: inclusivity, digitization, and green. So for any country to be able to engage with the international community, with the private sector, with trying to push more on gender, inclusion has to be key. Digital, because that's the platform through which the youth might get more engaged. The small and medium enterprises, startup ecosystems, which again are extremely important for the younger population in Africa and in the Middle East. And then number 3, the climate issue, greening, because today to be able to present a project anywhere, it has to have certain criteria which is agreed to. So these are 3 sides of a pyramid, if we're going to put an Egypt context, where countries need to think very carefully about. If we go back to 2015, countries all over have agreed to 17 SDGs. In the 17 SDGs, we have no hunger, we have no poverty, we have gender equality, we have partnerships, peace, etc. And if I link this to the food insecurity that has come out of the fallout of the war, it's very important that countries take preemptive action. And let me put this in the Egypt context. We are the biggest importer of wheat, and the two markets for us were Russia and Ukraine. However, when I was here in the spring meetings in Washington last April, and there was a state of panic, what's going to happen to Egypt? Things are going to be very, very tough. And I said, it's a shock, but it's not a state of panic. And there's a difference. And the difference comes from preemptive policy that the government took starting 2014. Two things I will mention. First, investing in storage capacity through silos. And silos, why do I mention them? Because they are development projects, but they also have climate in them, and they're very digital. So these are important investments which created jobs, created opportunities for storage capacity, which were extremely important, and they're across the nation. The second policy action which was taken starting 2014 was more agricultural land for wheat production and encouraging farmers for more wheat. So half of what we consume is actually locally produced. And this was extremely important. When the crisis happened, there was storage which was there, and there was also the capacity to increase local production. So those two policy items which were taken before the war helped mitigate the direct implications that everybody sort of, for good reason, the intuition was, this is going to be a very tough situation. The third item, and it has to go with what the managing director mentioned, the social safety nets. And again, prior to COVID, Egypt had very good programs with the World Bank, the Kafal Karama, social solidarity, the networks, and many of this put families on digital platforms to be able to encourage their families, particularly led by women, to take their girls to school. So there is that cash transfer that was taking place before COVID. When COVID happened, many of these families, we were able to increase the social safety nets to them. And then when the Ukraine war happened, then you are able to also, through digital coverage and through the programs that you had before the war, expand. So what I'm trying to say, and this goes back to what Jihad mentioned, policies and objectives. Very, very important for countries to know what is it that they are trying to achieve. And design policies, not necessarily at time of shocks and time of crises, but before, so that you are ready when the crisis happens. So this is to give a flavor of what Egypt has done on the food case, and we are continuing. It's not to say that things are easy, but they're manageable. And there's a very big difference between both, and it comes on the back of policies that were taken early on.
Thank you so much for your answer. So building on what you've just said, Mrs. Al-Mashat, there's a huge link between, and an important link between the idea or the issue of inclusion and the climate crisis that we're facing in the world. And the book argues that with many MENA countries facing more frequent and severe climate-related disasters, any inclusive growth strategy will have to include adaptation mechanisms. So I want to turn to you, Mr. Azzour. Can you tell us more about such adaptation strategies like that? Do you think the MENA region is ready to adopt adaptation methods into their agendas? How do you define an adaptation agenda? And what do you think are the main challenges that you see for more progress in this area?
Thank you. This is an important issue, and it doesn't come at the first cut in your analysis. If we agree that inclusion is about providing people access, enable them to get to access to the opportunities, and for those who can't do, to provide them with protection, to include them. Climate is one of those who prevent people from having access. and especially in the region. Although the region is not one of the leading emitter and contributor to climate issues, but the region is on the negative receiving end. Over the last 2 decades, temperature went up. It had impacted the GDP per capita. It has excluded those who are the most vulnerable, especially in the rural area in countries where agriculture is important. And more recently, we saw in many countries of the region how the same time you could have drought and flood, how water scarcity is very important. Therefore, it's an issue that needs to be addressed. Otherwise, we will keep growing informality. We will keep pushing people in the rurality into poverty. And this requires to have action that is integrated into the policies. This is something that we have recognized at the fund. And for that, we have developed an instrument which is about resilience and sustainability. And climate is at the heart of that. Therefore, adaptation is what all countries in the region needs, especially those who are on the vulnerable side of the equation. And those are many, because those vulnerabilities are compounded also with other type of vulnerabilities, especially countries who are facing conflict or are facing issues of refugees or displaced. Therefore, helping countries addressing those issues by mitigating the impact and preparing for gradual adaptation is providing additional opportunities to those who need it, providing more water, protect through climate the most vulnerable part of the population, preserve what is very important for the future, which is access to water, access to natural resources. And this requires very specific strategies needed to be supported not only by policies, but also by financing. And this is where the role of international community in terms of IFIs, MDBs, but also the private sector to help in that. We have recently issued a paper on this issue of adaptation. And there will be another one coming in the COP27 about mitigation, because we see those are the 2 legs that we need to in fact, to use for the region. We are, I would say, happy to see that several countries have developed climate strategies, have set objectives and targets, and some of them have already started the implementation. And this is why we have selected adaptation as the first element in this strategy, to be followed by other. And also the climate issue, and I will conclude with that, it's not a country-specific issue. It requires at least collaboration between countries, and I would say even more integration into policies, because those resources are shared between countries, could be a source of conflict, a curse, but also could be a blessing when countries share together water resources, electricity, as well as also other aspects in dealing with climate issues. Therefore, this is also one of the elements where regional cooperation is going to be important, and this is one of the new avenues of collaboration in the region.
Yeah, thank you. So we talked about adaptation regarding specifically the climate crisis, but I want us to take a step back and look also at social protection policies, because the need to mitigate the social impact of the different shocks, the food shock, the climate shock, energy crisis, debt crisis, the need to mitigate the impact of these different shocks runs against the very weak fiscal position, especially the one inherited after the COVID-19 pandemic. And so, Mrs. Ripani, in your view, how can the coverage and the quality of social protection and labor market policies and programs, how can they be improved? And how can we increase the efficiency of these policies and programs?
Thank you for the question, and thank you for the invitation. I think in Latin America and the Caribbean, where I work, we've shared many of the challenges that are faced by the MENA region. So some of the lessons learned from Latin America and the Caribbean could be applied to the region and vice versa. But a lesson from COVID-19 in Latin America and the Caribbean has been that income protection systems, income protection mechanisms were insufficient to be able to help all workers smooth their consumption and be able to thrive through the labor markets in a difficult time, right? So Latin American and Caribbean countries in general are called to transform. The managing director was talking about transformation, to transform the social protection and labor market programs and policies in order to be comprehensive, flexible, and sustainable. And I will highlight the word flexible because in our countries, many of the social protection mechanisms were based in conditional cash transfers, like you, Minister, were mentioning. And in this kind of programs, you are protecting or providing income to the extreme poor and the poor, but in the rural areas in some parts of the country. But the urban areas where workers lost their jobs during the pandemic, you didn't have the mechanisms in place to protect and provide income to these vulnerable workers that were facing a shock, right? So the importance of a transformation of social protection and labor market systems has to be one that complement existing strategies for structural poverty with mechanisms to provide income support when you have an idiosyncratic or systemic shock like the one that we had during the pandemic. And at the same time, we know that coverage and effectiveness of the programs, as you mentioned, should be addressed as well. And this has to be complemented with policies that provide support for access to work. And these policies have to be inclusive by design for women, for youth, for people with disabilities, and for other vulnerable groups that need more like attention in terms of access to jobs. And I would like to incorporate two aspects that were mentioned by other panelists, because the training systems in the region, for example, that are trying to provide support to have the competencies that are demanded by the labor market are not relevant for the needs of the labor market. And there are two spaces that are very important to in terms of opportunities. One is the digital skills or the digital sectors, and the other one is the green jobs or the green skills area. And for that, we still are seeing inequalities, for example, for women in the region in terms of green jobs. Only 1/4 of green jobs are for women in the region, right? Globally, every 62 women for every 100 men are called like green talent, right? And in the transitions that you see between 2015 and 2021, the transitions to green jobs, 63% were taken by men. So we are seeing that we still face big gaps in the access to jobs in the green jobs, but we also know that we face also a digital gap for women in terms of access to jobs. Many women in Latin America and the Caribbean access tertiary and university education. 60% are women, but only 30% of graduates of STEM careers are women. So I think in general, we have to work on the social protection system, but complement with labor market policies and programs that are relevant for the private sector and that are inclusive by design.
Perfect, thank you. So you touched upon the issue of gender disparities in labor markets, and this is an issue that the book also talks about. And the book argues that gender disparities in basic and financial legal rights are powerful obstacles to women's participation in economic life in the MENA region. Some progress has occurred, but still there's a long road ahead of us. Mrs. Al-Mashat, how optimistic are you that continued progress will occur in this area, and what are the main issues to be addressed, in your opinion?
Let me also link gender to climate and to adaptation, because they're very much intertwined. When we talk about adaptation projects, agriculture, water, security, which are extremely important, and the crisis from the war has shown that adaptation is important everywhere, and that no country is immune when we talk about food security and we talk about water security and so forth. The most disproportionately affected part of society when it comes to climate are women, particularly when it comes to adaptation or agriculture. And that's why when we are thinking about adaptation projects, it's not just because it's important for the environment, but it's also a protection for those who are most vulnerable, and they happen to be, by the way, the women in the economy. So this is a gender climate adaptation angle, which is extremely important. The other point is that reforms are a continuous process. So there's like, you know, it keeps on going. I remember today if Masoud is coming to Egypt, you will see that many of his recommendations several years ago have been implemented. And there's an agenda that, you know, still needs to be fulfilled and so forth. So there is always for governments an importance to be agile and to be exposed to what's happening globally, so that your policies can cope with the changes. When we look at, in our case, and I'm talking about gender in Egypt, 2017, there was a gender strategy that was launched at the UN. Within this strategy, there's economic empowerment, political empowerment, and social empowerment. And there are very clear objectives, and there are actions that are taken to meet those objectives. STEM schools were mentioned, or STEM education. We have designated STEM schools for women. We have today in cabinet close to 25% female, in parliament close to 30%, for the first time judges who are female. So there is a movement when it comes to trying to push forward the gender agenda and closing the gap. With the World Economic Forum and the National Council of Women, we also launched Closing the Gender Gap Accelerator, which is a private-public platform. So there are many, many initiatives that are pushing in that direction. And it's becoming, and this is very, very important when we talk about culture, it's becoming less unfamiliar for women to be in different positions. And always the point was at leadership positions, because that's where you have an ability to move policy. So you asked me if I'm optimistic or not. And as a policymaker, you shouldn't be optimistic or pessimistic. You should, keep on working. But no, there are many bright spots when it comes to the gender agenda, not just in Egypt, but in the Middle East. And we're seeing this in several countries. Even, for example, the cash transfer that I mentioned under the social protection or the Takaful and Karama is to encourage families to take their girls to school. So you go from a very wide general policy to a more granular action on the ground. One last thing on climate, because Egypt is hosting COP27 next month, so it would be a shame not to mention COP. Two key messages for this COP: adaptation and resilience, and we dwelled on that. And the second is from pledges to implementation. Finance is the fuel, if we can use that word, for pushing the climate agenda. And it's very, very important when we're talking in Washington and elsewhere to always emphasize the link between climate and development. They should not be seen as separate. And I think that's the trap that we do for ourselves. Any climate project is a developmental project, and today to do a developmental project, you have to have climate safeguards in there. So we need to see those as one. It's very, very important. And the other point is being able to mobilize financing, and the 100 billion that was promised in Paris we're falling short. We won't go over a debate of how short we are, but we know that we are short. So the idea is, how can we make sure that these pledges go into projects which are needed most in countries, be it adaptation projects or mitigation projects. I will just mention the case of Egypt. We launched the Nexus of Water, Food and Energy based on our 2050 climate strategy. And they have mitigation projects, adaptation projects, and we've been working with the international community to mobilize that. And this is a country-led platform, which is extremely important. And maybe with the RST that the fund is doing, it might be also an example there.
Thank you so much. I want to turn to Mrs. Ripani. You briefly talked about the issue of digitalization, yes. And the book touches on the implications for the region from the profound transformations in labor markets that arise from the increased use of artificial intelligence, automation, digitalization, and remote work, specifically in production processes. So based on your experience working in other parts of the world, to what extent do you think this is something that could increase labor market segmentation and income inequality? And how can governments address such challenges?
Yes. So in Latin America and the Caribbean, we have a title that we don't really want, that is the region with the highest inequality. So when you see like automation, digitization, and all of the things that are happening with the labor market, we try to understand how is this going to affect income inequality in our region. And one of the things that we in general think is that the new technologies are going to be good for prosperity, for growth in general for our countries. But when you see the probability of automation of different skills and occupations, you see that different occupations in the different parts of the income in this distribution are going to be affected differently. In services, for example, you see that cashiers in the supermarket, for example, that are at the lower end of the distribution are negatively affected. And in general, you see that automation is like affecting these low-income individuals. So if we're talking about robots, and we know that robots were very present in manufacturing, but now are going over other sectors of the economy, we should really have in place upskilling and reskilling mechanisms to move the people who are losing their jobs to other jobs that are open in the economy. And then we have the telework and the hybrid world that we are living in, right? So when the pandemic phase, when there was the pandemic shock, everybody had to go home, but not everybody had the same probability or the same possibility to telework. So in the region, for example, if you look at the numbers for Latin America and the Caribbean, you see that for those that were low-income workers in January 2020, only 28% could telework, while the high-income workers, 63% could telework. So you see that the differences in terms of the hybrid world is going to be also affected. And it's going to have a higher impact in income inequality for the lower probability of telework of the low-income workers. And then you have the digital platform economy. So in terms of the digital platforms, in the short term, digital platforms like the food delivery apps and all of that, they provide the opportunity to generate income in like a very short term, like in the short run. But we are facing still the challenge of providing social security, pensions, health insurance to the workers of the digital platforms. So it's a matter that we have to face with regulations and laws in the labor market to be able to provide the support to digital platform workers. So in general, you see that it's good for all to have these new technologies, automation, digitalization, telework, hybrid world, everything else. But we have to really pay attention to the mechanisms to move the losers to new jobs and new skills.
Yeah, and that's something that still requires a lot of work because it's a recent development. So we're still trying to understand what's happening and how to address it. So we have so far talked about several of the huge challenges facing the MENA region, and specifically we talked about the some of the current economic shocks happening. We talked about the food crisis, the climate crisis, labor market, and that crisis topics. We didn't really have the time to talk about it. But I want to return to Mr. Azzour and ask you how these different crises currently unfolding in the MENA region, how are they shaping IMF intervention in MENA? Like specifically, how can the IMF help mitigate the effects of these crises, especially as their economic effects, as we said before, will likely be unequal and hit more severely the poor, the vulnerable, the young women.
Thank you very much. This is an important question. I think one has to start by understanding the moment. Okay, the spectrum of risk is back. We have the 3 F's: food, fuel, finance. I would add another one, which is fragmentation. Those are issues that could lead to a tipping point whereby economic policies will be less effective in dealing with those issues. Why? Because also buffers have been weakened. We had the COVID crisis. We had also the increase in headline inflation, food and fuel issues have also affected the low-income people. Plus, that one of the buffers that organically used to work, which is informality used to protect, did not really work during this crisis. Therefore, we are in a situation where risks are high, our buffers are weak, and we know that in order to address the issue of inflation, you need to tighten policies which may lead globally to slow down in the economy. Therefore, the question is how to be more proactive. And the strategy now is to move from, if I may say, aspirational to operational. And this is what, in fact, this book is trying to do, is to trying to say, okay, those are the issues, we know them. We have tried to address them. How now we can integrate them more. Therefore, operational and integration are going to be very important, because addressing those issues cannot be done with only one instrument or one policy. You need to integrate those policies, because you need also to target those policies to achieve inclusion for certain categories. We spoke about youth, we spoke about women. We need to increase their participation. The COVID crisis did not help, because unemployment went up, especially for the youth. Women participation was made even more challenging. And in certain cases, you discover that small issues made the difference. If you invest in public transportation, you allow women to go to their work, and then if they have access to internet, they can work from home. Therefore, it's now about how you address these issues. How an institution like the fund can work, because those are issues that are, I would say, we work at the macro level, at the top of the pyramid, but we understand more and more that things are interlinked. And this is why we are trying to, on one hand, through our policy work, our analytical work, help countries have the capacity to implement those policies. How to address inflation, how to use the monetary policy tools in countries where not all of them, for example, have the flexibility. How to address the issue of external shocks and protect your economy. Countries with a high level of debt, how to navigate a very tight situation. And this is, I think it's an important pillar. We have accelerated our research work in order to provide policy support. But this is, of course, not enough. We have, since I would say the outbreak of COVID, accelerate our flexibility in providing support. We provided, as you know, instruments to help countries mitigate and address the issue of COVID, and the region was one of the most, I would say, the highest beneficiary for that in terms of number of countries and also in terms of fund support, more than $20 billion. Last year, because we understood that liquidity is going to be an issue, we provided through SDR the capacity for countries to address that. Going forward, I think 3 things. Back to basics. Countries have their own problems. They need to address them. And countries are different. And therefore, this is also our role. It could be done through policy support or through programs. But also there are some issues that need some specific interest. and specific support. And the Resilient and Sustainability Trust has the purpose of highlighting that long-term issues are also very important, even for today. And the idea of the fund is to be here leading the way, but also working with others, because what is needed is the convergence of effort by many. And this is where we think that the work we're doing on inclusion is kind of, I would say, the chapeau, the ultimate objective. And those policies and instruments will help deal with that. And three is there are some acute problems that are relevant for today, maybe addressed tomorrow. The food security issue, this is something that you cannot wait in addressing your structural policies in order to provide people with enough food. What we were fearing is the issue of accessibility and affordability. I think with time, accessibility is not an issue in terms of access to food, is more the affordability. And this is where we have selected an instrument that helps countries who are eligible but don't have enough resources, and where the fund can help. The last element here is something that we have now seeing the benefit is when you are with others, you are much more effective. Mm-hmm. And this is something that during COVID crisis, we accelerated it. And now I see us more and more into an integrated approach with other partners like the World Bank and others, but I would say also the regional institutions. Especially that the region is showing, I would say, a divergence. There are countries who are improving in terms of outlook, having additional resources. Those countries can help. And with the fund being a bit the partner, they can help in an impactful way through the policies and the reforms that the fund is promoting. Therefore, those are what we are seeing today is one piece of a puzzle that we are trying at the fund to be as rapid, as innovative, but also there are certain basics that are important. Economic stability is very important. Addressing debt issues is very important. Having the right policies is very important. Moving from subsidy that is untargeted and a waste of resources to something that is targeted. Set certain number of criteria in terms of structural reforms to address issue of gender and youth. This is also very important.
Thank you so much. So my final question is to Mr. Ahmed. We talked with Mr. Azrour about the IMF specifically and their intervention in the MENA region, but I wanted to conclude this conversation by asking you how you think other international organizations can be most effective in helping MENA countries address the current challenges they are facing and achieve a more inclusive model of development.
Well, I think what Jihad Azur laid out applies a lot to all international organizations. So in a way, the framing is very right for all of them. Let me just add a couple of things. The first is on the economic outlook. You know, Jihad said the risks are all facing downwards. I'd go further. And say that next year is going to be a very difficult year. Look, the fund downgraded its forecast for global growth to 2.7, I believe it was yesterday, to next year. But the consensus forecast is 2.1 right now. So whether the world is technically in recession or not, it will feel like recession. Interest rates will remain high for at least another year, probably longer. So all this talk that there's going to be a sharp increase, but then it's going to come down quickly, I wouldn't count on it. Trade flows are going to fall. Dollar remains high. Financial markets are going to be much less willing to provide financing. So if you're an emerging market, next year is going, when we go up to Marrakesh, things will be looking pretty grim around the world. So that's the context. And in that context, what can the international financial institutions do that goes beyond what they've done? And I would say, maybe three things. One is take more risk. It's very interesting to me that while the world the world's largest economies have taken a lot of risk in the last 3 years in terms of being able to provide a degree of monetary expansion, which they're now trying to find ways of coming, curtailing back. Fiscal expansion is unprecedented. The international financial institutions, when you look at the numbers, really haven't taken a huge amount of risk. Today, I think just to take the IMF, since I know it better, the IMF's balance sheet, I would say 3/4 of it is unused. So I would say over the next year, let's use up some of that balance sheet to help countries. Similarly, if you look at the multilateral development banks, they've scaled up a bit of their financing, but the disbursement numbers lag behind commitments. So the second thing is follow up on your plan. This was one of your 2 points, Rania. From commitments, from pledges to disbursement. Until the money actually works its way into the central banks and the budgets of developing countries, it's all talk, right? And third is that in a way, we've spent a lot of time in the last 2 years designing mechanisms. So in the fund is the RST, very useful. In the bank, for example, they've come up with a financial intermediary fund to deal with pandemic preparedness. But the amounts of money that are actually moving through these mechanisms have so far been quite limited, and we've got to make sure now we use these mechanisms to follow through and provide financing. So the first thing is, let's just get that money out in ways that are timely and useful, take a little more risk, and that's okay. That's what these institutions were created for, and this is the moment to take risks. And the other thing I would just say is that the dimension of risk also comes because in our region, in the MENA region, there are a few countries where the needs are acute, but the politics makes it hard to engage. Because the needs are important and you want to go and help, but on the other side, you've got a team that isn't always organized, it's got different views, politics makes it hard for them to come up with a common view. And I think those are going to be the really challenging cases that Jihad and his colleagues from the department and the counterparts in the international organizations will need to be working on. And the final thing I would say is, there are examples in the region, in each of these areas that we've been talking about, social protection or education, where there is very good progress and there's successful cases. And one of the roles of the international organizations is to be the conduits for the sharing of good practice in ways that accelerates the generalized adoption of good practice across the region. And that's a role, I think, that exactly the research and policy and advisory work that you were talking about plays. And it's not just what the fund can do, but I would say the other organizations can really step up that role as well in the time between here and Marrakesh.
Very important recommendations. Thank you so much, Mr. Ahmed. So we have 7 to 10 minutes for the Q&A with the audience. So I think we can have a round of 3 questions and or like 2 questions. So does anyone have any questions that you would like to ask the panelists? Yes, please. Can you introduce yourself and then ask the question?
Yes. Hello, my name is Halil Suki. I'm a research assistant at the Research for International Policy Implementation Lab. Oh, I'm not going to say that again. But first of all, thank you so much for the interventions of all the panelists. I think it was a very interesting and wonderful talk. And my question was about, when talking about inclusive growth, how do we target irregular markets or individuals that participate in irregular economic activity? Because I think, and this is very related, I think this is very related also in this, when you were mentioning the sense of being an outsider and an insider, and how that perhaps people prefer or do not have the opportunities to engage in a regular market, and therefore they work in an irregular market, and how, let's say, for instance, the IMF can provide incentives for those people to switch from the regular market to our regular market, and for them to see the long-term effects in general for the larger economy, and also as them as individuals in terms of social security, pensions, etc. So yeah.
Thank you so much for your question. The gentleman, yeah.
Hi, thanks so much for being here. I'm Alex Farley, Program Associate at the Wilson Center. I'd like to direct the question to Mrs. Mashhad and Rabhani, if I can. Specifically, in regions that share a lot of challenges with higher education specifically, what mechanisms have you seen most successful in post-secondary training to build a workforce, a trained workforce for the digital markets and the green economy? Maybe some examples if you can.
Thank you so much. Do we have a third question? Yes.
Thank you so much. Willie Lowry with The National. From a political perspective across the region, what's the biggest hindrance or factor that's preventing these governments from implementing some of these policies?
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. So maybe we can just have 1 minute for each, 2 minutes to address the questions. So we have one question on irregular markets, the question on the main obstacle facing countries to implement the policies, and one question on labor markets and education. So maybe we can start with ladies first, or?
Go for it.
Yes. Yes, I will take the question about the post-secondary education and the good practices. As I mentioned before, one of the things that, at least in Latin America and the Caribbean, is very challenging is that most of the investment in training services is not directed to the relevant, the private sector demand, right? So mechanisms that allow you to provide exactly the training for the needs of the private sector are important. And for example, competitive funds established by the government, co-financed with the private sector, that are sector-based. So you work with the private sector in a specific sector. For example, we're working in Jamaica with the global services sector, right? So a set of employers that are there in Jamaica, but also connected globally. And you put a fund together, a competitive fund, so they can apply with proposals for training for the specific needs of the employers in that sector that has proved to be very successful. So, and you can adequate or have the flexibility in the rules for the proposals to be made to target specific groups of the population. Or you can say you have to include in proposals socio-emotional skills as well as technical skills because they are transferable to other industries, right? So you have so many things that are good about competitive funds on a sector-basis approach, and we're hoping that we can work with many countries in the region, but we're working with several of them in this way, and I think it has been proved to be successful.
Thank you.
On the question on informality, very, very important. We all know that the size of the economies are bigger because of the informal sector. There have been many efforts in different countries. In our case, for example, the new SME law is trying to give tax breaks and include the pensions and so forth to include them within the economy. So it's a process, and I think issues related to taxation and reporting are key in this. When it comes to the training, and following up on your intervention, private sector plays a very big role. In our case, we have private sector companies that have set up training centers with the government so that those who are trained would find the job and get the training needed for and the skill set that is required by the private sector. So there is, and this is an example of private-public partnerships. Also, in light of partnerships in general, we have with the Germans, vocational training centers and so forth. So on a side, we can go over several of this with you. On why countries don't implement policies, it's not that. It's just that every time you're implementing on a path, you are hit by a shock. And then you need to reorient and reprioritize. It's a fact of life. So that's why when we say agility and being able to move ahead, COVID, for example, was the biggest experiment when it comes to policy. And I think many countries surprised on the upside by the ability to move ahead and very quickly, try and overcome the interruption that took place. So the issue is we live in a world today where we are more prone to frequent shocks than before, and this would require a lot of imagination, a lot of innovation, but a lot of partnership and trust between players, stakeholders, be it domestic stakeholders or international stakeholders. But Jihad used a very important word, fragmentation. So until we are able to work our way through that globally, we will always be in a situation where countries have to juggle with a lot of priorities at the same time.
Thank you.
Go ahead, sir.
Let me just add one small footnote to what Rania just said on the second of her responses, which is, I think the economic policies in any country are a reflection of the equilibrium that comes from an interplay of political forces, interests and lobbies, power groups, historical institutions, and external players and how they engage with the country. And in some ways, in our region, maybe it's the absence of shocks that has been one of the reasons why policies have been stable. And as Rania was saying, when you do get hit by a shock, sometimes you surprise yourself by how, on the upside, by the actions that you can take. So really the question is how over time we can move from one equilibrium to another without relying on destabilizing shocks that impose their own costs.
Yeah, very quickly to complement what has been said, which I fully agree with. On the issue of informality, I think the COVID crisis gave us a lot of insights, how to address it, and how I would say we could act in the short term and in more structural way. In the short term, I think technology has helped us to improve access to those who are in the informal sector. Access is very important, and I think access to finance could be one of the quick wins that one could develop, as well as also access to market. There are more structural issues that are policy-related issues that bring people out of the formal business arena, and those need to be addressed. And those are policy-made, man-made, can be addressed. And I think this is an opportunity that for many countries to use this moment to accelerate those reforms, because you need this in order to create opportunities in your local market. On the issue of very interesting but very difficult question, the literature of political economy of reform is very wide. I would add only one element. Previous shocks taught us in the region that acting too little, too late was always wrong. And we know, and I think all of us here highlighted that risks are high and the vulnerabilities are also high. And therefore, I think what we need to do, learn from previous crises, to act very quickly, to go really to some of the structural issues that maybe in the past we were able to delay, because it's much easier to delay things, and to bank on change in the cycle to address those problems. I think this is a moment where we need to go fast. We need to address the immediate stabilization issues, which are very important, because shocks are some of them are, I would say, internal, but also some of them are external. But I would say to accelerate the transformation, I don't see another way for countries to reduce the risks, mitigate some of them, and get ready for when the economy will recover. The past was very clear on that. And I hope, and this is the message that we are conveying, because the outlook for the region this year is relatively, I would say, benign compared to what we are seeing around the world. But when you look forward, when you put this in a dynamic process, you see that shocks are coming and you need to get ready now.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we ran out of time, so we will not have time for another round of questions. But thank you so much for attending the event. I hope it was insightful and enriching to you. We discussed the idea of inclusion and how inclusive growth, an agenda of inclusive growth can be implemented. And the four panelists tried to untangle and highlight the interlinkages between different development challenges, including the climate crisis, gender disparities, labor market segmentation, digitalization, the debt crisis, and the food crisis. And we concluded by talking about the role that the IMF can play and other international organizations. And I want to end with one of the suggestions made by Mr. Ahmed on the importance of translating commitment and pledges made by the international community into actions, because that's what at the end makes a huge difference and an impact on the ground. So thank you again for our audience here and our virtual audience. Sorry we couldn't take any questions from those of us from the audience online. Thank you to our four panelists, Mr. Masood Ahmed, Rania Al-Mashat, Shihad Azrour, and Laura Ripani. And have a lovely day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So Rania, we stay connected
Yes,
on
yes, I
this
will send
before
you.
shutting down.
Nice to meet you.
That'd be great.